September 1997. The flowers were still there. Outside Kensington Palace, the bouquets had not yet been removed. Millions of them, rotting slowly in the English rain, releasing the last sweet smell of public grief into the grey London air. Diana had been dead for less than a month. Inside the palace, the institution had already moved on, or tried to, because what happened in the weeks and months that followed Diana's death, inside private rooms, at formal dinners, at state occasions, revealed something the public was never meant to see. A quiet war between what Charles wanted and what the Queen would permit. A war fought not with arguments or memoranda, but with seating arrangements. And at the centre of it was a woman Diana had named, clearly, calmly, without flinching, as the reason her marriage had never truly begun. Camilla, we are going to come back to exactly what happened at that dinner. We are going to sit in the room with them. But first, you need to understand what Diana had already said in her own voice, on tape, preserved in audio that nobody inside the palace ever expected to survive. Because Diana told us what Camilla meant. She told us years before the institution was forced to acknowledge it publicly. She said there were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded. 11 words, delivered in 1995 to Martin Bashir on Panorama, watched by 23 million people in Britain alone. The palace called the interview a disaster. Charles's advisors called it a declaration of war. The tabloids called it revenge. Diana did not call it anything. She simply waited for the world to absorb what she had just said. She had known the truth for years. She had been living inside it since before the wedding. This is where you need to hold the timeline. What most people know about Camilla Parker Bowles is the fairy tale version of the story in reverse. The woman Charles was always supposed to be with. The love the palace blocked. The happy ending that arrived too late. What Diana knew, what she documented, described, and eventually said aloud, was something far more specific. The morning of her wedding, July 29, 1981, Diana was 19 years old. She stood in the glass coach, moving through streets lined with people who believed they were watching a love story begin. She was wearing a dress with a 25-foot train. She was about to make a vow in front of the world. She had already found the bracelet. It was a gold charm bracelet, engraved with 2 letters intertwined, a G and F, not Camilla's initials. Something older, more private, a name Charles had always used. Gladys. Fred, the private nicknames they had given each other years before Diana entered the picture. Charles had commissioned it, had it made, intended to give it to Camilla before the wedding. Diana found out. She confronted Charles's closest aides. She watched the bracelet disappear into a bag, watched it leave the palace, watched it go to a woman whose name was not yet spoken openly in polite royal circles. She described what she felt in those hours in recordings made privately in the early 1990s, authenticated by multiple sources and later published by biographer Andrew Morton. She said she felt sick. She felt the walls going in. She asked 2 of her sisters whether she should go through with it, whether any of this was right. One of them, Sarah, told her it was too late. Her face was already on the tea towels. That was it. She got into the glass coach. She made the vow. She became the Princess of Wales in front of 650 million people worldwide. And she came home knowing. The years between 1981 and 1992 are not a story of gradual discovery. They are a story of Diana discovering, repeatedly, the same truth, and then watching the institution require her to perform as if she had not. She found letters, she heard phone calls. In 1989, at a birthday party for a mutual friend, she walked into a room and found Charles and Camilla in conversations so private that they did not notice her for several seconds. She walked toward them. She stood in front of both of them. She looked at Camilla directly, and she said, "I know what's going on between you and Charles. I wasn't born yesterday." The room did not move. Charles said nothing. Camilla's face, according to multiple accounts by those present, remained composed. Diana walked away, not because she was defeated, because she had said what needed to be said, in front of a witness, without shouting, without weeping, without giving anyone present the satisfaction of watching her fracture. That composure was not weakness, it was control. She was 28 years old and she had already learned something the palace had never anticipated, that silence, timed correctly, is louder than any argument. Now we arrive at the dinner. Diana was gone. The world had spent 30 days in collective mourning. The flowers outside Kensington Palace were still decomposing. And inside the palace, the question that had been suspended for 16 years was suddenly open. What happens now with Camilla? Charles had waited. He had been patient in a way that very few people in his position could have managed. He believed, or had been led to believe, that with Diana's death, the architecture of opposition would soften. That the public grief would eventually turn into acceptance, that the Queen, who had never permitted Camilla to appear at the same events as Charles during the marriage, would allow the picture to change. He was wrong, not immediately, not visibly. But at a formal dinner in the months following Diana's death, the precise date and location of which has been documented across multiple royal biographies, Camilla moved toward the seat beside Charles. It was not an accident. She had been doing this gradually, small steps, small presences, carefully managed reintroductions into spaces where she had previously been invisible. The Queen was also in the room. What happened next was not a confrontation. It was something quieter and more permanent. The Queen, through a combination of instruction to staff and her own repositioning, made clear, without raising her voice, without making a scene, without a single sentence that could later be quoted, Camilla would not sit there. Not tonight, possibly not for years. The seat beside Charles remained empty or was filled by someone else. Camilla was placed elsewhere. The dinner continued. You need to understand what the Queen's refusal meant. It was not loyalty to Diana. The Queen and Diana had one of the most documented, most complex, most deliberately misread relationships inside the monarchy. The Queen had not always protected Diana. She had not always understood her. There were letters between them, formal, correct, distant, that read less like family correspondence and more like two institutions attempting to negotiate territory. But Diana had been the Princess of Wales. She had been the mother of the future king. She had been watched by the entire world, lowering her son's hands to press them against their father's coffin, then placing them gently back. Wait, wrong story. She was the one who died. The world had watched William and Harry standing outside the palace. The world had watched two small boys walking behind their mother's coffin. The world had not forgotten who their mother was, or what had been done to her, and neither had the Queen. The Queen understood with the precision of someone who had spent 70 years reading rooms, that the British public had not yet reached a place where Camilla beside Charles was something they could absorb. The flowers were still at the gates. The grief had not shifted into history. The image of Diana, the real Diana, not the fragile fairy tale version, but the woman who had sat in front of a camera and spoken clearly about what had been done to her, was still present in millions of living rooms. To place Camilla in that seat, in that moment, would not be a gesture of love. It would be a signal, and it would be the wrong signal. The Queen was not protecting Diana. She was protecting the monarchy from what it had done to Diana becoming publicly visible all over again. Diana had understood this years earlier. She had said, in recordings made privately, that the monarchy did not want her to be a queen. It wanted her to be a princess. Decorative, contained, she had said that every time she showed any substance, any knowledge, any capacity for political empathy, the machine around her found ways to reduce it. She had spoken about her visits to hospitals, to AIDS patients, to landmine sites in Angola. She had spoken about what happened when she returned from those visits and tried to explain what she had seen. She said she was told to be careful, to stay in her lane, to remember that she was not the foreign secretary. She had smiled at that. She said, I am well aware of what I'm not. That sentence is worth carrying. Because what Diana had learned, through the bracelet, through the letters, through the birthday party, through 11 years of performing a marriage that had been purchased rather than chosen, was that the institution did not require her to be ignorant. It required her to perform ignorance. There is a difference, and she had named it. Camilla and Charles were married in April 2005. A civil ceremony at Windsor Guildhall, followed by a blessing at St. George's Chapel. The Queen attended the blessing. She did not attend the civil ceremony. The distinction was not accidental. In the language the royal family has always used when it cannot speak directly, which is the language of presence and absence, attendance and withdrawal, proximity, and the deliberate creation of distance, a final statement about what had taken 8 years to negotiate. The seat beside Charles had eventually been filled, but it had taken time, and it had taken the slow, careful work of public rehabilitation. And it had taken the agreement, never publicly spoken but understood by every party, that Diana's sons would be central, that Diana's memory would not be erased, that the institution could not afford to be seen to have simply replaced her. William and Harry attended. There's a photograph that exists from the early years of Charles and Camilla's public relationship. They are standing together at an official event. They are correctly positioned. They are doing what the institution required. Diana is not in the photograph, but she is in the photograph. She is in it because the entire protocol of how they stand, how far apart they are, how carefully the image was managed, was constructed in direct response to what Diana had said on camera, what Diana had recorded privately, what Diana had refused to unsay even when the pressure to do so had been immense. She had said, there were 3 of us in this marriage. Even in death, even in the photograph she is not in. She is the third presence. She is the reason the frame was built so carefully around the other 2. That is not weakness. That is not fragility. That is what it looks like when a woman refuses to be erased from a story she was always the truest witness of. The dinner ended. The seats were cleared. The palace moved forward in the direction it had always intended to move, but the Queen had refused. One gesture, one quiet repositioning of where a woman could and could not sit, One moment in which the institution's memory of what it had cost the public, of what it had cost Diana, held briefly against what Charles wanted. It was not justice. It was not restoration. It was not the apology Diana never received. It was smaller than all of those things. It was an empty chair. And Diana, who had learned to read every silence in that institution, would have known exactly what it meant.